It's time for another year-specific rankings. Let's talk about 2001. Welcome to my ranking of all the films that came out in the year 2001. No, just kidding, that would be ridiculous. I'm just going to be ranking the films that I have personally seen that came out in 2001. There are 22 such films, so we've got a good chunky ranking today. The top two today will be going through to the eventual grand final of 100 films, where I will be declaring once and for all what the greatest film of all time is. But for now, let's talk about 2001. This is quite a good year, actually. Lots of good films to get through today, and the top two in particular, wow, absolute cinema gold. But we'll start off at the bottom, as we always do. So let's find out what is my 22nd and therefore least favourite film which came out in 2001, at least of the ones that I've seen, of course. This is the first Planet of the Apes remake that they did, and I was just so bored all the way through it. I bought a cheap DVD that cost about £3, and as soon as the film was over, I literally picked the DVD up. Well, I took it out of the machine first, obviously, put it back in the box, dumped it in the bin. This is the only Planet of the Apes film I will absolutely never ever watch again. The only bit of it I liked was the last couple of minutes, which sort of teased a possibly interesting second film, which never came because this film was so bad and it didn't do very well. Tim Burton is very hit and miss for me. I loved the original Batman that he did, and Alice in Wonderland was pretty good as well. On the other hand, he's done these films that I just don't get. Batman Returns was a really strange sequel for me. I didn't like that one at all. And what was the other one I saw of his? It's not going to come to me, but don't bother with this film if you've never seen it. Just take it from me. This was a sort of cyber thriller starring Hugh Jackman as the good guy, John Travolta playing yet another bad guy. I think Travolta was sort of coming to the end of his long cycle of villains at this point, and about time, because it was starting to get a little bit tiring seeing him do the same shtick time after time. Vinnie Jones is in this as well, although it's probably the least effective I can ever remember Vinnie Jones being. I'd heard really good things about this film, but when I started watching it, I just found it really hard to get into, and by the end, I was just completely mentally checked out, really. I just couldn't get into it. When they cast the new Bond after Pierce Brosnan, Hugh Jackman was actually in the running to play Bond. I think the final shortlist was something like Hugh Jackman, Clive Owen and Daniel Craig, and I remember thinking at the time, God, I hope they don't go for Jackman. That was that doofus from that Swordfish film I didn't like. Please, no. Clive Owen was my second favourite, I'd say, and Daniel Craig was the one I wanted, bizarrely. Now, given the fact that I don't normally get the castings that I want for movies, this was a rare occasion where I did, and I was really happy about that. Would Hugh Jackman have made a good James Bond? I don't know, but I can guarantee he wouldn't have been better than Daniel Craig. This is a prison film starring Vinnie Jones, again, second film running today. Just goes to show you how effectively Vinnie Jones managed to get his teeth into the Hollywood system at one time or another. So in this film, he plays a guy who is sent to prison. I can't remember what for, probably nothing too bad, given the fact that he's the good guy in this film. Once he's there, he gets involved in a prison football team with all the guys on his block, and they end up in a friendly match against the prison guards, but they're not expected to win because the guards are basically like a really well-drilled, really efficient team. They're basically a bunch of semi-pros just masquerading as prison guards almost, but of course the prisoners train really hard, and at the end of the film I think they're able to beat the guards by like 1 goal or something. I can't remember exactly what happens, but I'm pretty sure it's that typical Rocky Balboa type glorious ending, you know. I saw this film in the cinema actually. I just happened to catch it with a friend of mine. We went to the cinema this one afternoon and had a pretty good time. It is a black comedy, so you do get a few laughs throughout. I remember this really funny bit near the start. Just as Vinnie Jones gets arrested, I think these two coppers turn up to get him, and one of them's like quite short, only about 5'6", and Vinnie Jones just turns around, spots this guy, starts laughing and goes, "It's a miniature copper!" And for some reason, that line has just stuck with me 20 odd years. And there's another funny bit later on when the prisoners are training in really dopey ways, and it keeps cutting to the prison guards. They've got all these fancy equipment, they're doing all these well-organised drills, and it's pretty humorous, but on the whole, I mean, I've never gone back to the film in all this time, but that one afternoon that me and my friend just happened to watch it, we had an all right time. Another football comedy film, or soccer, I guess, if you're from the States. So in this one, there's like a manager of a Premier League club, Norwich maybe, who ends up managing the England team, but he's really hapless, and yet despite that, he still takes them on some glorious run at like the World Cup or something. I haven't seen it since it came out, and I can tell you that even from my perspective, somebody who really loves football, has a deep understanding of football, I wasn't exactly creasing over laughing at this film. It has a few good moments. I remember one in particular where Mike Bassett, he likes to write down his team selections on the back of his cigarette packet. So this leads to Benson and Hedges accidentally getting selected for England. And I think this journalist says to him at a press conference, who else have you got in that squad? Lambert and Butler? But that's quite funny. But on the whole, this is certainly a forgotten film, I'd say. And yeah, you've definitely got to be into football, and you've probably got to be British as well. There's probably a lot of British-centric humour in this that I'm not sure you'd get if you're from somewhere else in the world. This is a franchise I've never been able to get into, really. I can remember around about the time it came out, I was in the pub with a friend and he was telling me about the movie, and he said, look, the first half is really great, he said. It's full of atmosphere and suspense and you don't quite know what's going on. And then about halfway through the film, you find out who's behind all the mayhem, and then the rest of the film is kind of bleh. And I sort of nodded my head and said, okay, well, I'll give it a chance. And I watched it on home video, I think. I didn't see it at the cinema. And you know what? The film played out exactly as my friend said it would. First half great, second half, I don't know. As soon as I found out who the villain was or what the villain is in this, I just wasn't really impressed. I was kind of like, oh, right, it's that thing, is it? All right, okay. And I've never gone on to watch it again. I've never seen number 2. I've never seen number 3, which I hear is absolutely dreadful. Maybe at some point I'll give it another try. I think they're making a 4th film. I think one of the reasons as well why I've never gone back is I heard this story at one point, like the main creator of Jeepers Creepers turned out to be a sex fiend or something and ended up going to prison. Bit of a scandal. He's now completely shut out of this franchise. But yeah, it's been a long time since I saw this original film, and my reaction from what I recall was just, yeah, it was all right. Nothing more than that. Even though I love Friday the 13th, it's very much a series of slowly diminishing returns. Jason 10, even of itself, is an entity of diminishing returns, because the more times I watch this, the less I think of it. The first time I saw it, I actually thought it was really good. It was like, oh wow, Jason in space, this is awesome. But yeah, second, third, fourth time, it just gets less and less enjoyable. And by now, all these years on, after all these viewings I've had of it, I just find myself aching for a more serious version of Jason 10, you know, something like Alien, that kind of tone, and not this brightly coloured, semi-comedic mess with paper-thin characters. A robot girl jumping around with an Uzi, being silly and stuff. I wish they'd have gone for different than what they did with this. It's such a shame. But you know what? Every time I'm going through the Friday the 13th films, I still watch it, I still stick it on, and there are bits of it that I still enjoy, but it's not a great film. So if you've only seen like the cover art of this film, you might be forgiven for thinking it's a romantic comedy. You know, you've got Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz just smiling away. You've got a title of Vanilla Sky, and surely that's going to be a really schmutzy, horrible film that I just don't want to watch. It's actually a kind of thriller with sort of sci-fi overtones. So Tom Cruise is playing this guy. He's like a playboy. I'm not sure if he works. I can't remember. It's been a while since I saw it, but he leads a very carefree lifestyle. He's a bachelor for the most part, but Cameron Diaz is his sex buddy, fuck friend. I can't remember how it's phrased in the movie, but as you can imagine, Tom Cruise is having the time of his life in this film, but then his life is sort of turned upside down because of an accident that he has, and then he finds out that he's not living in reality, strictly speaking, so there's sort of like a Matrix type twist in this. I'm not going to reveal all of the secrets that happen in the second half, but it's very interesting. The film goes in a few directions I totally did not expect, having seen the first sort of 20-30 minutes. So I would absolutely recommend giving this film at least one watch. It's quite decent. I'd say that the second American Pie film is roughly the same quality as the first one. Most of the characters from the original do come back for this. I think this is the last time in this series that would be the case. I did try and watch the third film once, American Pie The Wedding, but I couldn't get past the first half an hour in all honesty. So this is the last time in this ranking series that we're going to see any American Pie films pop up. I think this one takes place a lot of the time in some kind of holiday resort. I'm picturing a beach in my mind, and I think at the end of the film, Jim, is that the main character? He finally gets with his band camp girl after 2 movies. There's not enough Shermanator in it though, at least compared to the first film. I loved that character, but yeah, it's all right. You can get a few laughs from this. I've watched it at least a couple of times, I'd say, from just noticing that it's showing on Sky. So there we go. I got into Fast and the Furious quite late in the day. I think there were like 5 films out already by the time that I even watched the first one. It was very much a case of jumping on the bandwagon and trying to find out why they kept making these films. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. This original is very different from what they're doing now with like Fast and the Furious 8, 9 and 10, completely different type of movie. This first one is very much about street racing and street gangs and one cop's attempt to infiltrate that world, but the characters are pretty well drawn. The cars look amazing in this, and I'm not even much of a car fan. The only thing I would have changed a little bit about this first film, I would have had more action at the race wars place in the desert. I thought that was an amazing location. I didn't think they quite made the most of it, but on the whole, this is a film which still stands up over 20 years after it was made. It's not the best Fast and the Furious film, but it's certainly nowhere near being the worst. This is a New Zealand comedy film set in New Zealand, starring New Zealand actors. It's about pool, or 8-ball. Me and a friend just randomly spotted it in a video store back in the day, and we ended up renting it and really enjoying it, and we ended up watching it together like 5 times over the space of 2 years. So it's about these 3 friends who hang out in their local all the time playing pool, and they get involved in this underground pool tournament run by some local gangster or another, and there's quite a lot of money for the winning team. So they take part and they go all the way to the final. It's a typical sports film, you know, but genuinely funny, at least if you understand pool. If you've never played pool, you don't understand pool, you might not get a lot out of this, but I personally did, because I actually used to play a lot of pool in pubs when I was a lot younger. There's some really funny scenes in this. One match they play, they're waiting for their opponents to turn up. 2 priests come in the door with pool cues, and they're like, seriously? And these priests are like, yeah, we're a team. And this one priest just looks at them and taps his cue and goes, let us play. And there's another match they have where, so I don't know if this is the case actually in New Zealand for real, but in the film, it's the culture that if you lose a game of pool without potting a ball, then you have to drop your trousers in the pub. It's called the down trow. And it's the way... This really rock-hard gangster type ends up having to drop his trousers in front of everyone, and he hates it. But me and my friend were just watching this film, having conversations about whether this could actually be a thing in New Zealand. It certainly isn't the case in England, but it's such a funny thing when you see the way that it's used in the film. It's really, really cool. So this is probably the least heard of film on this rankings, but give it a try. It's really, really funny. To give you a quick history on this one, at the beginning of the year 2000, I really got into Tomb Raider games. I was at uni at the time, but I could not get off these games. I'd play them like halfway through the night, trying to solve the various puzzles and do the various levels. I was totally addicted. I absolutely loved them. So when it got to 2001 and the release of this film got very close, I was really excited. I was super hyped for it. I went to see it with my dad when I was back home from uni in the summer of 01, but it was a bit of a disappointment, in all honesty. I pictured in my head that this would be like Raiders of the Lost Ark, but with Lara Croft in it. it totally wasn't that. It was like a weird MTV movie with barely a drop of creative spark in the entire thing. I mean, Angelina Jolie is very good as Lara Croft. Daniel Craig's in it as well. It's very, very early Craig. Ian Glenn plays the bad guy. He's pretty good. But it just feels like this movie should be better, and it's not. It's always been a disappointment to me. I still sort of like it, which is why it's 12th. But at the back of my mind, I know that the only reason why I do enjoy it and will occasionally go back to it is because I'm such a big Tomb Raider fan. You know, for most people who don't like the games, they probably won't get much out of this. But the franchise itself has certainly proved to be very durable. You know, they're still doing these films. They've got a new one coming out next year, I think, a sequel to the Alicia Vikander reboot. So we're going to get a 4th movie. I think there's an animated series in the works for Netflix. So, you know, the Lara Croft appeal endures. It goes on and on. But when I think back to 2001, yeah, this film was a little bit of a disappointment, it's got to be said. At the time of doing this video, it's March 2022. This June, there's a new Jurassic Park film, the 6th in the series, Jurassic Park Dominion. Once that has come out and I've seen it, I will probably do a rankings for the whole franchise. It's a series that I really like, so it makes sense for me to do that video. So I won't talk too much about Jurassic Park 3 today. I've not seen it in a while. From what I can remember, it's quite entertaining. It doesn't have the greatest of reputations, but Sam Neill's back for this. He leads a group of mercenaries back to the original island from where it all began, and what you get is basically 90 minutes of dinosaurs killing people, and somehow Sam Neill is not one of them. Of course he's not. He has to come back for Jurassic Park Dominion, which should be fun. So yeah, I like these films on the whole. I'm definitely a fan of Jurassic Park. I've just recently got my 10-year-old son into them. We've been watching them on Saturday nights, so that's been fun. So yeah, I'll leave it there in terms of Jurassic Park 3, and it's time now to go into the top 10. I've got a mixed relationship with Harry Potter. My wife is an absolute addict. I met her just before the 6th film came out of the cinema, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. So I ended up getting dragged to watch that one, and then the 7th one and the 8th one. So basically all the bad films, because when it comes to me and Harry Potter, I only really like the early ones, early to sort of middle of the range, you know, back when the characters actually went to their lessons, and then maybe at lunchtime they'd try and solve the mystery of the secret dungeon. They were stories that reminded me of other things that I was into when I was a child, you know, things like the 3 Investigators and the Famous 5. But once the characters get to the point where they're going out in the world fighting these big wizarding battles against Voldemort that could potentially result in the world's end, and they're suffering adolescence and they're hiding in the woods and they're not going to school, I just lose interest by that point. You know, J.K. Rowling, she likes to sort of increase the stakes, story by story, book by book, but that didn't make them better. Also, I think I was born a little bit too early to fully get into this series. You know, I was 17 already by the time that the first book came out. If I'd have been 7, wow, I mean, that could have really resulted in Harry Potter being one of my favourite things ever. But as it is, I'm of a generation that probably just missed out on this, I'd say. But I'm not going to cry about it. You know, if I'd have been born 200 years earlier, I never would have seen any movies, and that is a really scary thought. This is a really good film from back when Johnny Depp did really, really good roles. He needs to do a film like this in 2022. It could sort of really help his career, you know, do something where he's not just wearing a silly costume or trying to put on a silly voice, you know what I mean? So this film is about a pretty normal guy called George, who is just hanging out on the beach one day, just selling a bit of weed to make a few dollars, and then he ends up getting involved in like small-time criminals doing more serious drugs, and then it just kind of escalates. He goes higher and higher up the drugs food chain, if you like. So this film is a little bit like Scarface in a way, except George is not a hard nut like Tony Montana. It's a rise and fall kind of film. You know, we spend a lot of it watching George's rise up through the criminal empire. He doesn't want to do this. It just kind of ends up going in that direction for him. But later on in the film, things take a tumble. It has to, you know. This film's not going to put out the message that drugs are good. You know, it's going to show exactly what ultimately happens to people like this who do try and become millionaires through nefarious means. But it's a bit heartbreaking, though, the end of this film. It really is. But it's very, very good. George marries Penelope Cruz at one point during this film. I mean, that is his ultimate peak of the mountain, and then after that he starts to come down. If you've never seen this film, give it a shot. It's a really, really decent film from a sadly bygone era of Depp, which just doesn't seem to exist anymore. I have to admit, I'm giving very serious thoughts to eating your wife. This is the sequel to Silence of the Lambs. It's not regarded as being anywhere near as good as that film, but I really like it. I mean, I do think Silence of the Lambs is better, but for me, Hannibal is like only very, very slightly below Silence of the Lambs in terms of quality. I think the main reason why people are not so hot on this one is the fact that Jodie Foster didn't come back to play Clarice. And it does have an effect on the scenes between Hannibal and Clarice. You do find yourself really wanting Jodie Foster to be there. But that's not a reflection on Julianne Moore. She's an excellent actress and she does a good job with this film. I'd even say that Julianne Moore is a better actress than Jodie Foster. I would just want Jodie Foster for this role, you know. But if you can look past the fact that we have a new Clarice, it's an excellent film, well directed by Ridley Scott. Soundtrack is amazing. I bought a 3-disc DVD for this once, I've still got it. And I think one of the discs is literally just the soundtrack from what I can remember. It's really, really good, lots of classical music and stuff. It's a very violent film. The first time I watched it, I can't remember what age I was, probably 20, 21, I don't know. But I actually had to go to the bathroom, and straight after it I felt really sick because some of the imagery you see in this, Ray Liotta with his brain hanging out, and this other guy with his guts hanging out in the middle of Florence. Some really tough stuff to have to sit through in this, but it's an excellent story, really enjoyable, and it amuses me no end that, and I'm giving a spoiler away here, but it's been out a long time, this film. It amuses me no end that at the end of this, Hannibal actually gets away. So given the fact that they ended up making a prequel with Hannibal in it, he has 3 films here, Anthony Hopkins, where he's playing Hannibal. At the end of all 3, he gets away. I just find that really amusing. This is a Japanese animated film about a girl who accidentally crosses into some kind of spirit world, and she has this really wacky adventure, and she has to try and get out, obviously. It's not a kid's film, I'd say. It's not an adult film either. It's sort of, it's for everybody. It's just a kind of, any age can enjoy this film. I was very impressed with it when I saw it. It's very creative, some of the stuff that you see in this. Obviously animation is not for everybody, but the Japanese certainly know how to do animation. If I had more time on my hands, I would get into these films more. As well as this one, I think I've seen one called Howl's Moving Castle. There's a whole bunch of them out there. And if you want any further proof as to the quality of this, I think it did win the Academy Award for Best Animated Film in 2001, so there you go. I'm a big Tremors fan. At some point I would like to review the Tremors films on my channel. This one sees the action go back to perfection, the same town that was in the original film. So I think in Tremors 2 they went to Mexico. This time they're back in Nevada where it all started. Is it Nevada or is it Utah? I can't exactly remember, but because we're back in the same town from the original film, we get to see some of the incidental characters who were in that film, which is kind of cool. And this is the first time that Burt would be the main character in the series, and he absolutely proves, Michael Gross, that he can pull that off. You know, there's no Kevin Bacon or Fred Ward this time around, which is a shame, but it's still a really good film, and they evolved the creatures a little bit further as well. So we get something called the Ass Blaster this time, basically flying worms. It sounds a real jump the shark sort of thing, but it works somehow. They pull it off, and this whole movie is a lot of fun to watch. The only thing I'm not that keen on is the ending. There's this weird prank that Burt does on this guy, but it's a really dangerous prank, and we don't actually get to find out what happens to this guy, and I'm kind of thinking to myself, okay, is this guy going to be all right? This is what I'm thinking as the credits are coming down, but on the whole, I like this film. The sequels and prequels in the Tremors franchise are of a very, very high quality. This is another animated film, so we've got 2 animated films in the top 10 today, which is highly unusual for me, but I was a massive Final Fantasy fan back in the day, especially during that period where 7, 8, 9 and 10 came out. So I was always going to give this particular film more than a fair crack of the whip, but I think it did largely fail commercially, a bit similar to the Tomb Raider film with Angelina Jolie. But in the case of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, it was almost set up to fail, because here's the thing with the Final Fantasy series, it's tradition that every single game follows its own different story, different characters, and they kept to that tradition with the film. So with this, we had a completely new set of characters in a new world. It was nothing to do with any of the games, really. So it wasn't easy for even fans like me to get that excited about this film, even though I did seek it out to rent when it was finally available. Leaving aside the Final Fantasy name, this is still a very, very high quality sci-fi film set in space, but certainly I don't think it did very well at the box office, and it did cost a lot of money to make, I believe. They did try and correct their mistake a few years later by releasing another Final Fantasy animated film, but this time based on Final Fantasy VII, that they brought the same characters back. They almost tried to say, right, this time we're giving you characters that you know and love. But I don't think that film was anywhere near as good as this one, The Spirits Within. You know, it might not have had anything to do with the games, but it was still a very, very good film. Certainly a more adult film than something like Spirited Away. Just talking about it now has really made me want to seek it out again, actually, because I've not seen it in quite a few years. If you saw my 1999 rankings, you'll know that I absolutely love the first Mummy film that had Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz in it. This second one, I didn't find so easy to love, at least in the beginning. Obviously, I did make my peace with it and start to enjoy it, hence why it's number 4 today, but that first viewing wasn't good. I was living in a student house at the time, and me and this girl, we sort of agreed to go to the shop and rent a movie for the evening, but we had totally different tastes, and I think The Mummy Returns was our sort of meeting in the middle sort of film. This was something that I could pass off as being not quite horror, so come on, give it a chance. But honestly, even I was surprised at how little I actually liked this. I mean, she walked out like halfway through. I think she said, "Oh, this is a kid's film. I'm not really into this." And to be honest, yeah, it does have a much sillier tone than the first film. They really doubled down on the banter between the main 3 actors, and they certainly dialed down the horror quite a bit, I think. So first time around, not impressed. And something else I didn't like as well. So the 2 main characters have kids in this one, but the 2 lead actors, they look the same age as they did in the 1999 film, pretty much, and they would do. This was like barely a year or 2 on, but now they have these like 10, 11-year-old kids. That was a bit jarring, I must admit, you know. So yeah, it took a few viewings. I finally learned to appreciate the fun that you can have with this film. It is a fun film. It's not a horror film like the first one can claim to be, but it has improved for me over time. So here we have the film which only just misses out on the grand final. It's a magnificent war film. It's set in Russia, featuring predominantly Russian protagonists. I know that might be a little bit uncomfortable for some people at the moment, given the fact that the Russia-Ukraine war is in full motion. But you know what? I could watch Enemy of the Gates today and it wouldn't bother me, you know, because this film was set in a completely different time period, completely different Russian government, completely different people. You know, the Russians were the good guys during the Second World War. So we've got Jude Law playing a guy who's like a sniper, and he goes up against Ed Harris's German sniper. They keep trying to pick each other off in the middle of this constant ongoing battle between Germany and Russia, and it's really enthralling. Rachel Weisz is in there as the love interest to Jude Law. So this is 2 films in a row where Rachel Weisz has been involved. I think it's Rachel Weisz in this film. So earlier on in the ranking, we had Vinnie Jones popping up in 2 consecutive films. Now we've got Rachel Weisz doing the same thing. I promise you that is completely and utterly a coincidence, but I love how realistic this film plays its action. You know, at the end we don't get some kind of stupid Hollywood fight between Jude Law and Ed Harris. You know, this is a sniper battle which ends as a sniper battle would in real life. You know, same thing at the end of American Sniper. They did exactly the same thing, and I appreciated it. I think it was my dad who got me into this film. He said, "Oh, you've got to watch this film, Enemy of the Gates." I'd never even heard of it. I think I said to him, "You sure you don't mean Enemy of the State?" He's like, "No, Enemy of the Gates. It's like, it's a really great war film, blah, blah, blah." And by the time I had seen it, I had to admit, yes, you are right. This was a really, really good one. I think I've seen this like 2 or 3 times now. So it's time to get to the 2 films which are going through to the grand final, and we'll start with this one. I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings. I liked it even before the movies came along. For my 12th birthday, my dad got me the complete novel of Lord of the Rings in paperback, and he even wrote an inscription on it saying, "To my son, on his birthday, kiss, enjoy." And I kept that book for like decades. I don't have it anymore. Eventually it died because it was a paperback, and because I read it so often over the years, the spine started to come loose and pages started to come out. At various points I would use sellotape to get the pages back in. I tried desperately to keep this book alive, but to no avail, so I don't have it anymore, sadly. But I've always loved the story, and I really got into these films when they came out. I've got the extended versions now on DVD, and this first one is still one of the best out of all the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films that would eventually come out. I think what I like about this one is that it's pretty much a straight chronologically told story. You know, you go on this adventure with all these colourful characters of all these different races and stuff. Not like the later films where we're sort of bouncing from one area to another and we're keeping account of lots of different characters and situations. Those films are great too in their own way, but this one has a really special sort of feel about it which would never be replicated again, I don't think, unless you sort of count the first Hobbit film as trying to do a similar thing. I guess that was of a similar flavour, you know, the Hobbit and all the dwarves going on a fairly straightforward adventure in terms of the narrative. But I love Lord of the Rings. You know, 2 big fantasy series began in 2001. One of them was Harry Potter, the other one was this one, and out of the 2 I would definitely consider myself a bigger fan of this one. I think at some point I will do a rankings of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films. But this film, Fellowship of the Ring, has only come number 2. Let's find out which film somehow managed to even beat this one to the top spot. So we had a war film at number 3, and we've got another war film at number 1 to finish things off. Black Hawk Down is the absolute bee's knees. Again, Ridley Scott. How the hell did he manage to do Hannibal and this so close together? The man is an absolute workhorse. Even today in his 80s, he's pretty much the same. I wasn't familiar with the conflict that this film is based on at the time I watched it. Even now I don't know an awful lot about it. Clearly the Americans got themselves into some kind of scrape with some Middle Eastern country or another that they were occupying. This whole film takes place within a 24-hour, 48-hour time frame. So they go on this special operation in this like town square. I think they're trying to take out some local drug lord or something, but loads of Americans end up getting trapped in the streets, and so they have to send in more soldiers to rescue them, and it just becomes an absolute war zone. Really great film. It's photographed so well. I mean, visually, this film is amazing. It looks so good. I've got the 4K version now, but even when I had it on DVD, I remember thinking, wow, this film just looks so great, honestly. I do want to choose my words a little bit carefully because I do respect the fact that this was a real set of events. You know, real men did die out there, but if you're someone who really does appreciate how great war films can look on the screen, then you'll get a lot out of this. This film was done so well, and it improves with every viewing. I think I've seen it maybe 3 times now. Wow, what a great film. It is going through to the top 100. So there we have it. We have our 2 finalists from 2001. It's going to be Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and Black Hawk Down. So that wraps up my ranking from 2001. I guess there is one more question left to ask. I'm going to be very quick with this section today because my dog has been whining for a walk for most of the last 20 minutes. I've had at least 2 takes that I've had to redo because of his whining. So very quickly, here are 4 films from 2001 I have not seen that I would like to. Sexy Beast, Ghosts of Mars, Joyride, and Behind Enemy Lines. Okay, that concludes today's video. I'll be back very soon with rankings for 2002. Until next time, cheerio.